Robert Philipson is the president of the production company Shoga Films, a Harlem Renaissance historian, and a filmmaker. Robert directed Rockland Palace, which highlights Harlem's queer history. Now stay tuned for my interview with Robert Philipson. So for anyone who's not seen your film, Rockland Palace, how would you describe it?
It is a documentary fantasia.
Okay.
It's based in fact. I mean, to that extent, it's a documentary, but it uses animation and excerpts from different sources to bring it all together. It's very short. It's 5 minutes. It just goes right into the doors opening on the ballroom, and then you hear snatches of conversation from the ballroom floor, which were actually taken from a 1933 novel written by two gay writers called The Young and the Evil. So, a documentary fantasia.
I am actually curious about The Young and Evil. So it was originally published in 1933, written by Charles Henry Ford and Parker Tyler. So the novel follows a group of friends in New York, and this is a description of it that I found online, who spend their time swapping beds in apartments, avoiding the hostile attentions of the police. They cruise in the park, wear makeup and gaudy gowns. Did you read the novel? And if so, what impact did it have on your life?
You're going to have to forgive me, but my co-director here
Oh, cool.
I'm being part of the interview. And he also is a black and white. You know, I did read The Young and the Evil.
Okay.
It was a struggle.
Okay.
It was written in this fragmented, modernistic style that even though the subject matter was very ahead of its time, hasn't been recuperated into the canon of gay classics because it's very difficult to read, and frankly, it's probably not a very good novel when all is said and done.
Okay.
But it does reflect what gay life was like in New York in the early 30s for a group of young white homosexuals.
Okay.
So, you know, it had documentary value, but I wouldn't urge anybody to read it unless they're desperately interested in the period.
And so Rockland Palace was a venue where drag balls would take place in the city. And so the particular balls would take place from like the 20s to the 30s. And that also overlaps with the Harlem Renaissance, which took place between 1918 and 1937. So 2 films that you worked on, Congo Cabaret and Smoke Lily Jades, also take place during the Harlem Renaissance. How has the Harlem Renaissance come to be your muse?
Before I became a filmmaker, I was a professor of comparative literature, and my specialty was Black and African literature.
Okay.
So I knew a lot about the sort of overall suite of African American literature, from Phyllis Wheatley to what was then the present. That was the 90s. The Harlem Renaissance was because I was gay. I was always alert to hints or implications or even outright statements that this person or that person was queer. But back in the 80s and 90s, it wasn't as openly talked about as it is now. So it was a history that needed to be excavated. The last course I taught at the college level was on the Harlem Renaissance. And that's when I said, there is a lot of material here. And that's when I transitioned to filmmaking. So it was, and the more I've gotten into it, I mean, I've been working in the subject matter for 20 years now. And the more I've gotten into it, the deeper and more fascinating I find it. And the more queers I'm uncovering.
Do you remember when you first discovered the history of Rockland Palace?
Yes. There's this well-known early essay that I'm not going to be able to recall from memory because I'm sinking into Alzheimer's. But it's called a Fantasia of Color. I think the author was Eric Gerber. I could come back and give you the reference, but it was an early academic article that gave a brief overview of what was known then about queer life in the Harlem Renaissance. Very good overview. And that's where I first read about it.
Okay.
Let me, as long as we're plugging here, this shirt that I'm wearing
in the light,
yes, features a drawing by Richard Bruce Nugent.
Okay.
And he was one of the early queer writers to be recuperated by academics and activists. And there was he was befriended by a white college professor who worked at HBCUs by the name of Thomas Worth. And Worth he realized that Nugent had been pretty much forgotten.
Okay.
And was living in Hoboken at the time and was pretty close to being homeless. Worth realized this guy was a treasure trove and eventually edited an anthology of his work, which was published. Richard Bruce Nugent, it's called not Queer Rebel of the Harlem Renaissance, that's Claude McKay. It's an anthology of Nugent's writing.
Yes.
And it has a 50-page introduction that Worth wrote, which is still the best, most readable introduction to queer life of the Harlem Renaissance.
Oh, wow.
So that was, I deepened my knowledge there. And then, I did, when I was working on a documentary, which is forever in production about queer life, queers of the Harlem Renaissance. I'm sorry, I shouldn't be looking at that so much. I'll try to stay still. About queers of the Harlem Renaissance. I was doing research, which, in newspapers and following various paths. Because I was an academic, I know how to do research. So
I am curious. So Rockland Palace, is the building still standing today?
It is not.
Okay.
It was huge. It was a block, covered a whole city block.
Okay.
And it was so big, in fact, that there were two orchestras sometimes, one at one end and one at the other end. Okay. Chick Webb, who was a famous band leader from that period, was in residence there. And then there were other orchestras. They would have these fights. I mean, they would have these competitions between the two orchestras, who could get the most dancers out on the dance floor.
Okay.
But once the Depression hit, Rockland Palace was no longer economically viable enterprise. The building was abandoned, started falling into disarray, a fire hazard. They tore it down.
Okay. The drag balls would take place there. And I'm not sure if sometimes I hear it's called Hamilton Lodge. Would it be called Rockland Palace when it was a queer event? Where did the two different names come from?
The dance was sponsored by a Black Oddfellows Lodge, and I believe it was the Hamilton Lodge.
Okay.
The Oddfellows organization, or that branch of it, goes back to the 19th century.
Okay.
You have to remember that Harlem was part of New York before it was incorporated in New York City. It was associated with Alexander Hamilton. He had his residence up that way.
Okay.
It's still there. It's called the Grange. And Hamilton Heights gets its name also, and is also in that part of Manhattan geography.
Okay.
So when the lodge incorporated, they took the name Hamilton Lodge. They began the dances towards the end of the 19th century.
Okay.
And they were always costume balls. They were always fundraisers. But as time went on, they became gayer and gayer until finally during the 1920s, it was just called Kids Ball.
Oh, wow.
But it wasn't the only one.
Okay.
At the end of the 20s and into the 30s, you had a pansy craze. So in the major cities, Chicago, San Francisco, Atlanta, you also had drag balls.
Okay.
The biggest and most famous ones were in New York. Rockland Palace was just the venue for this particular one, the Hamilton Lodge Ball.
New York City is the place that I think of when I think of like gay culture and queer culture. And I feel like archivists, novelists, and elders have just kind of like passed down these oral histories. And I love that it's centered around drag balls and ballroom culture. Is there one particular person from the Rockland Palace drag balls that stands out in history?
I want to make a comment on the general setup of your question before I answer the question.
Okay.
There is a New York bias to all of this, which overlooks what was happening in Chicago and Atlanta in particular.
Okay.
Queer culture wasn't confined to New York, and I can give you one example. There was a famous drag queen performer by the name, she was called the Sepia Gloria Swanson, and she gained her reputation in Chicago.
Okay.
But one of the prominent members of the New York Harlem Renaissance, Aurelia Walker, who was the daughter of Madam C.J. Walker, very rich, would throw parties that were gay and straight, mixed black and white, different social classes. She went to Chicago, saw the Sepia Gloria Swanson, brought her back to New York, and she became the toast of New York. But she started out in Chicago.
Yeah.
So there are different ways that feeds in.
Yeah.
So is there one person that's associated with the balls at Rockland Palace?
Yeah.
The balls at Rockland Palace ran all through the 20s and stopped in the early 30s because of the change in economic and social conditions. So during that whole time, there was no one person who was synonymous with organizing or representing the balls. Every year they would have celebrities of the time judge the contestants for the drag parade, Queen of the Ball. She would be a crowned Queen of the Ball on the basis of the voting of, as I say, celebrities of the time.
Okay.
Name some names if I can remember them, but they would not mean very much to a contemporary audience.
Yeah. If you could choose one person, who is your favorite person from the Harlem Renaissance era?
Oh my God. There's so many to choose from.
Okay.
Well, Richard Bruce Nugent, of course.
Yeah.
Langston Hughes. Elaine Locke. I've really gained a lot of respect for Locke in the course of my research. because
Locke, is that the person that wrote Kane?
no, that is
Oh, Toomer. Gene Toomer.
Gene Toomer.
Yeah. I don't know. I've heard the name Locke before, but I can't place it.
Alain Locke is most famous for editing an anthology in 1925 called The New Negro.
Okay.
And that was the announcement of the literary Harlem Renaissance on the cultural stage.
Okay.
He was definitely one of the midwives. He was a critic. At a professor of philosophy at Howard University.
Okay.
There was 3 years ago, I believe, there's a Black professor, Jeffrey Stewart, who wrote a biography of Alain Locke called The New Negro, and won both the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award for Best Nonfiction that year. It's a very worthwhile read. So he should be much better known than he is, and like I said, I've gained more of a respect for this guy because I knew about what he had done for the literary Harlem Renaissance, but he also did a tremendous amount for the visual arts.
Okay.
He was one of the first to promote an Afrocentric aesthetic in the visual arts. So yeah, you were asking about my favorite people. There's so many.
Okay.
Bessie Smith. Whites were part of the Harlem Renaissance as well. So Carl Van Vechten was a central figure, and I've given you a couple of names there.
Okay. What is your favorite film about the Harlem Renaissance?
Well, of course, Hollywood wasn't making movies about Black people during the Harlem Renaissance. Or if they were Hollywoodized.
Yeah.
So they weren't necessarily realistic or taking place in New York.
Okay.
The most famous example of that would be Hallelujah, which is early all-Black musical.
Yeah.
It's pretty embarrassing to watch these days. A white director.
Okay.
Pretty embarrassing to watch these days. Michaud was making movies, but he didn't make any movies specifically about the Harlem Renaissance. A couple of movies were urban based.
Okay.
Retrospective movies about the Harlem Renaissance. Of course, the most famous one would be Francis Ford Coppola's Cotton Club.
Okay.
Which is entertaining, but does the usual thing, which is it focuses on its white protagonists, and the Blacks in the movies are there for the purposes of entertainment. So, God, I don't think there's been a movie that accurately portrays the three-dimensionality of the Harlem Renaissance, except for Smokin' Liz and Jay. And I don't mean to puff myself up here. It's just that nobody's taken a serious academic approach to it all. All they have to do is mention Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, and they've checked those boxes. Go on.
What city is more important in gay history, do you think?
What city?
Yeah, what city is more important in gay history?
Well, New York. I mean, New York hands down.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Why New York?
Because it was the cultural capital
of
America. So what happened in New York got broadcast, written about, visited. People would come from Europe to go to the Harlem nightclubs. There were Black nightclubs in Chicago and Atlanta as well during that time.
Yeah.
people from Europe didn't go to those; they went to New York. So New York.
This is one of my favorite questions. So queer history is not taught in schools, and people of color are often erased. Who is a queer person of color that history has forgotten and more people should know about?
Practically all of them. I mean, it's what level of knowledge are we talking about? I just mentioned Alain Locke, and he has been fully presented to the world in all his complexity and importance with this biography that has received accolades. Most people probably still don't know who Alain Locke is. So how do you get, how do you get people to become household names like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Okay. Is there anything else you would like our viewers to know about you or your film, Rockland Palace?
Yes. Every month, Shoga Films, my production company is called Shoga. Can I put in a plug here?
Yeah, of course.
Our website is shogafilms.com. Every month we put out a newsletter, and the newsletter has different themes. There's an academic essay, there's a personal essay, there's a song of the month that is related to the theme. We talk about highlights, what we're putting out, because not only do we put out films, but we also put out podcasts.
Okay.
And we have a wider, we cast our net wider than just the Harlem Renaissance or even the Black queer community. It's about intersectionality.
Okay.
But we don't shy away from the fact that we're taking an interracial approach to this whole to this whole area of interest, and it has its challenges and it has its drawbacks, and we confront those as directly as we can, and I often do it through the writings in the newsletter. So I would encourage people who want to find out more about the Harlem Renaissance, the various people that I've alluded to, because I have essays on Jean Toomer, queer poets of the Harlem Renaissance, Connie Cullen, lesbian participants in the Harlem Renaissance who are much less known.
Okay.
So there's a lot of material there that I think people will be interested in.
Thank you so much for agreeing to do this interview. I have learned so much about you and your work, and I really appreciate it.